going to focus on social disorganization theory and enemy theories as well. So social disorganization and enemy theories have a common thread. They're both looking at the role that order and stability play in our communities and how order and stability can lead to conformity. Therefore, the opposite would also be true. Disorder, instability would be conducive to crime and deviance. So a social system is considered organized if there is consensus on norms and values, cohesion amongst its members, and social interaction proceeds in an orderly fashion. Both social disorganization and enemy propose that the less solidarity, the less cohesion, the less integration, the less stability in a group, a community, or a society, the more crime and deviance we should see in those communities or societies. So let's begin by looking at social disorganization and the urban ecology of crime and delinquency. So these theories first begin in the University of Chicago. They're often referred to as the Chicago School of Thought, and they developed in the 1920s. This is basically what University of Chicago's sociology department becomes known for. And what they start doing is they sort of take a look at communities from an ecological perspective. And they want to see if there's any trends with communities. So they plotted the residences on a map of youth who were referred to the juvenile court. And they found that there was a systematic pattern that existed. You guys might recall from intro criminology that you would see sort of these concentric zones, right? With the middle of the city, areas that aren't residential having the highest rates of crime. And as you move further and further away from the center of the city, the neighborhoods become more affluent, they become more stable, and we see less crime. So they found a pattern. And they also found that this pattern remains stable regardless of the composition of the communities. So the 1920s are also a period of a lot of immigration. And over time, we see different groups sort of being the new immigrant group. And what they found was that it didn't really matter what immigrant group was living in the area, these patterns of crime remained. So the rates of crime and delinquency in lower class neighborhoods were highest in the inner city. As we move outward to these more affluent areas, that decreases. And this was maintained over decades. So they basically look at this in terms of the same way they look at the ecological communities of plants and animals. And they developed this theory that I just mentioned called concentric zones. So basically that zone in transition, okay, think of it like a bullseye, okay? In the middle is your commercial and business district, okay? These are communities where not much is happening after dark. They're non-residential. The zone right outside of that is the zone of transition, where we start moving from residential communities, from commercial communities to residential communities. And those have the highest rates of delinquency. These communities were characterized by physical decay. So these are communities where the upkeep is not maintained. The housing is not very good quality. There's what they refer to as incomplete and broken families. So these are non-two-parent married homes. There's high rates of illegitimate births. You guys might not be familiar with this term. It's not really used so much today, but this refers to children that are born outside of a marriage. And there's an unstable, heterogeneous population. So the population is mixed and diverse. Residents at the bottom of the socioeconomic scale tend to live there, so this tends to be low income, low education, lower end of occupation. And along with this come high official rates, so not unreported rates, high actual rates of adult crime, drug addiction, alcoholism, prostitution, and mental illness. They believe that these were outcomes of what is referred to as social disorganization. Okay? And this comes as a normal response by normal people to abnormal social conditions. And one of the reasons why these rates remain the same over time, regardless of who the next immigrant group is because crime and delinquency begin being transmitted from one generation to the next. During the same period, we have a lot of industrialization, There's a lot of urbanization, lots of social changes, and this leads to disorganization. So essentially, if you guys think about some of the communities that some of you may have grown up in, there may have been a lot of social control. So I grew up in a community where I grew up on a street where pretty much everyone lived there until my parents sold their house maybe 10 or 12 years ago. I didn't live there that long. But there was a whole series of kids that were my age, and then there was a whole series of kids that were my sister's age in the community. And pretty much everyone lived there until their kids were adults. So people have lived in these homes for a long time. The neighbors knew each other. The kids knew each other from the neighborhood. They knew each other in school. They were able to sort of look out for each other. They knew when people were out of town. They would notice if you knew that the family across the street was out of town and you started to see someone over at their house, you would know, perhaps that's somebody breaking in or somebody who's not supposed to be there. These are communities that can work together to resolve their problems. Communities that are socially disorganized, okay, and they tend to basically have these characteristics here. They don't have the ability to pull themselves together and change their community and create some social cohesion. So there's been a lot of research on the ecology of crime and delinquency. They've looked at trends of migration of both white and black middle-class residents. So what has sort of happened as people become upwardly mobile and move out of these poorer communities. They've looked at how industry and business has changed, and this has resulted in what they refer to as an underclass, a group of people who are truly disadvantaged. So this is communities with high rates of unemployment, high rates of welfare, again, illegitimate births, single-parent families, drug use and violence. So in these same communities that have these characteristics, research is showing us that there are high arrest and conviction and incarceration rates. And remember, these are what official measures are telling us, okay? So we know that official measures do not capture how much crime is really happening in a community. And so that means that the crime rate is probably significantly worse. We don't know how much inner city crime is the result of social disorganization because this is a hard concept to measure. You guys might recall, we probably talked about this before, but maybe you talked about this in research methods as well. That sometimes we're measuring variables that are easy to measure, okay? So if we want to measure the age of everybody in our class, this is an easy thing to do. I can ask everybody for their date of birth, and then I can calculate your age, not just to the year, but I can calculate it very precisely. We can calculate it to a decimal point. If we want to know what everybody's sex is, again, I can poll everybody. I could find out the town you lived in. These are easy variables to measure. But social disorganization is an abstract concept. Right? We're talking about communities that essentially are disorganized, right? How do we measure that? So what we have to do is look at other variables that we think point to social disorganization. Now, if you wanted to study this for your senior capstone project or for some piece of research, what you could do is look to prior research for guidance. How have other researchers measured social disorganization? You could also look at critiques of that and figure out how to measure that better. So one thing that sometimes happens is sometimes this is measured tautologically. So sometimes people are using crime and deviance as a measure of social disorganization, right? So let's think again about what it means for something to be tautological. Just circular argument. So we're saying crime and deviance, if that's a measure of social disorganization, leads to social disorganization, okay? Crime and deviance leads to crime and deviance. Even when we look at these very high crime areas, the majority of people who live in these communities are law-abiding folks. So a minute ago I said, many of you may have grown up in very socially organized communities. Some of you may have grown up in high crime areas as well. But you may have been law-abiding folks. So how much concentration then of official crime rates results from criminal behavior amongst residents or from race and class disparities and police practices? So how much of it is the way the police are policing those communities versus how much criminal behavior is actually happening? So one thing that we've talked about in the past, not in this class, but in some other classes, is sometimes it's not so much that poor folks are engaging in more crime. as it is that they live in communities that are highly policed, right? And the more police presence there is in your community, the more likely you are to get caught if you're breaking the law. So what conditions constitute social disorganization? Sutherland said perhaps urban neighborhoods are not disorganized, but rather organized around different values and concerns. So if you remember learning about conflict theory, one thing that sometimes gets talked about is, do we all agree on the norms and rules for our society, or is there some conflict about that? So sometimes, perhaps, there's some theorists who've argued that it's not that the lower class is violating middle class norms, it's that they have completely different norms. Social disorganization begins receiving some renewed attention through Sampson and Bursick and some others. Sampson, I believe, is over at, Sampson's done some work on life course trajectories and desistance from crime, and I believe he's at Harvard. They reanalyzed the theory, related it to current theories, and addressed some criticisms that have been levied against this theory. Bursick pointed out that Shaw and McKay, right, so Shaw and McKay are concentric zone guys, they're actually proposing that disorganization undermines informal social controls within the community, and this is what allows the high rates of crime to occur. So if you remember the example I just gave you about the neighborhood I grew up in, talked about how the neighbors looked out for each other. That's informal social control, okay? In my neighborhood growing up, and this doesn't happen as much today, any parent in the neighborhood could tell any kid in the neighborhood that their behavior was out of line. If my next door neighbor told my mom that I was doing something I shouldn't have been doing, my mom would have absolutely believed her, and I would have been in trouble for that. That's informal social control. The community keeps the community safe, okay? And this is one of the problems we sometimes see in these high crime communities, that when the police and the community are not on the same page, and when they don't trust each other, it's really hard to keep the crime rate down, okay? What the police really need to do is empower the community to take back their community. So basically, Bursick's saying then that the absence of social control is the key factor behind social disorganization. Bursick also links it to routine activities. Our routine activities affect where we are, what we're doing, how much guardianship there is, whether or not motivated offenders and suitable targets collide in time and space. That distributes the crime opportunities that are available. Bursick also notes that social class and race are variables that have been used to measure social disorganization. Okay, certain groups of people, based on looking at class or race, maybe live in communities that are more likely to be socially disorganized, but that's not really measuring social disorganization. So Bursick has essentially addressed some criticisms of the theory, but no one has directly tested what Bursick is talking about here. So this is a nice theory, but we haven't tested it. Sampson and Groves offered an empirical model of social disorganization. So they looked at the usual measures that affect social disorganization: social class, family disruption, residential mobility. Residential mobility is usually measured in the census, and it's measured by the number of houses that are renter versus owner occupied, and there's a measure in the census that looks at whether or not the person living in the house now lived there 5 years ago. Might be 3, but looks at that. They also include some other components. Little community supervision of teenage gangs, informal friendship networks, and participation in formal organizations. Sampson and Groves looked at this with some British communities, and they found that these were good predictors of social disorganization. That these were good measures of social disorganization, and therefore good predictors of crime rates. Not much research has followed this model, though, of trying to measure social disorganization directly. So Warner and Pierce have reported that there are strong relationships between racist telephone calls to the police and neighborhood poverty, racial diversity, residential instability, family disruption, and high density of housing units. So that's a lot of housing units within a small state. Godfredson and McNeil looked at census data on disrupted families, poverty, unemployment, income, and education, and they compared that with self-reported levels of aggression, theft, vandalism, and drug use. These measures were able to account for individual delinquency, but not strongly. What seems to mediate most of that effect, when you account for social bonds and friends, that's what's really causing those differences. Silver continued to use indirect measures such as disadvantage and mobility. A study in Chicago found that neighborhood level measures do have an effect on violence amongst former patients released from a psychiatric institute, but not as much as individual variables like impulsivity and prior history of violence. Wickstrom and Lober looked at delinquency that had begun in later teen years and found that it was related to neighborhood disadvantage. So adolescents at high risk are more likely to be delinquent regardless of the neighborhood context. And that's why we have many programs and policies that are aimed at working with high-risk teens and high-risk children. Jamie Johnson tried to measure directly perceptions of neighborhood disorder and to test that relationship to adolescent substance use, and did find that there was a significant relationship. How religious one was a protective factor, so that was a factor that protected people against offending. But even here, substance use was more strongly affected by social learning and social bond variables. So one thing that's really important to do in these things, in these pieces of research, is not just to measure the things that you think are going to be important, but to measure variables that other folks have found to be important as well. So Sampson says social disorganization affects crime because it affects informal social control. This leads to the conclusion that what researchers call informal social control is affected by social disorganization, operates through variables and processes of social bonding, social learning, and self-control. So essentially what we're looking at here is that some communities may be socially disorganized. That might lead to higher crime rates in those communities, but what is happening and how that operates is through social bonding, social learning, and self-control. So Sampson also talks a lot about this concept called collective efficacy. Essentially, that social disorganization impacts collective efficacy. Okay? So collective efficacy is the ability of a neighborhood to take action when confronted with problems in their community. Again, think of the example I gave you about the neighborhood that I grew up in. These were people who worked together. They were involved in different community organizations together. And so if there had been a problem in the community, they would have been able to come together, lobby the appropriate agencies, and get help addressing that. If you remember, though, one of the things I told you was that the people in my neighborhood had lived there for a very long time, 10, 15, 20 years, okay? That makes a big difference, right? Because people get a chance to know each other. They take some ownership in their community. What happens in communities where there's a lot of residential instability? So what are some projects that are based on these theories? So one thing we want to think about is structural theories are talking about things that exist in our community that become criminogenic features and that promote criminal behavior, okay? So what we would want to do then is try to change those things, right? So if the problem is, we always want to be thinking about policy implications. So what the theory is telling us is that people are offending because their social bonds are weak, and we want to find ways to strengthen their social bonds. This is one reason why people will talk about how being involved in community activities decreases the likelihood of kids offending. One, they're busy, right? So if they're playing sports, if they're taking music lessons, they're busy, right? But it also helps strengthen their bond to the community, and they're less likely to offend. A lot of these problems have faced political difficulties, and most of them have had limited success. So some have dealt with how we can organize communities, how we can work with gangs, training programs. So one thing that happens after this research comes out of Chicago is that in the 1930s, the Chicago area projects begin. There are several lower-class, high-crime neighborhoods, and the objective here was to try to get these communities to mobilize some informal social organization amongst the law-abiding residents. This is sort of like the idea that if the community decides to come together and say, we're not going to take any more of this nonsense in our community, they're going to be much more effective at controlling the crime rate. Another objective was to try to overcome the influences that delinquent peers and adults have on other people in the community. So they wanted to provide more opportunities for young people to associate with law-abiding folks. This is sort of like mentorship. They also tried to look at some of the actual features of social disorganization. They improved sanitation, traffic control, taking care of rundown buildings. So if you think about it, what theory does that sound like? Sounds a lot like broken windows. They organized clubs and groups led by pro-social adults, summer camps, athletics. They mobilized other leaders in the community, police, juvenile justice system. It's important to note that the juvenile justice system began in Chicago. Churches, social workers. They started what is sometimes referred to as a street worker program. These are detached social workers who work specifically with gang members, and they work with them on the streets in their communities, trying to connect them with other resources and get them involved in non-delinquent activities. And Boston does have a street worker program. Long-term studies found some mixed success. One issue here is that we could try to look at these programs and see how well they're doing, but if there's a lot of variety in how they're implemented, it's hard to know what's working and why it's working. Professional social workers were pretty critical of amateur volunteers. The rates of crime were reduced in areas with strong programs, which does indicate some evidence of success. The Boston Mid-City Project is based on Miller's theory, which incorporated some features of the Chicago area projects. They provided direct social work services to families. They had a community neighborhood program, and as I mentioned, a detached worker program, and that was run by grad students. The only thing that actually got put into place, though, was the detached worker program, and the community was really kind of ticked off about that. They did, however, identify and reach a large group of gang-involved youth and get them involved in other, activities such as sports and clubs. Conflicts among community groups stopped the project, so it was difficult to tell if there was any success. Detached workers also seemed to give some of the gangs prestige, like, hey, we're badass enough to need our own detached workers. So it sort of became a status symbol. MOBI is the Mobilization for Youth program, and this is based on blocked opportunities. So this is the idea that not all opportunities are equally distributed. So what they wanted to do was give lower-class youth access to more legitimate success through job opportunities, education, and skill training. And they also used detached workers. And the goal here was to redirect gang members away from crime and towards conventional activities. This faced some political problems, and there began to be a growing gap between what the program called for and what was actually implemented. Again, here, some gangs tried to be really delinquent because the detached social worker became sort of a status symbol. MOBI did serve as a prototype, though, for programs like Job Corps and the Office of Economic Opportunity. So just a thing to note here, too, is that Boston had a really successful program in the 90s. The late 80s, early 90s was a very gang-involved period of time, in particular in Boston. And Boston put together what's called, and it still exists today, the 10-Point Coalition. And they basically grabbed community leaders and brought them together. And some of the community leaders are religious leaders. And they were actually able to drastically decrease the gang violence by having community leaders come together and essentially increase the informal social control in the neighborhood. All right, if you have any questions, let me know.